The wind rattled the loose window pane in the upstairs bedroom, whispering a chill through the cracks as David stared into the darkness of his ceiling. Insomnia had become his nightly companion, a symptom of the growing gulf between him and Emma. When they married 6 years ago, it was with an earnest promise of forever. He could still see the love in her eyes from their wedding day, etched into his mind like a half-forgotten dream. But now, those eyes seemed miles away, locked behind walls he couldn't climb. It wasn't any one thing, he reminded himself. That was how it usually worked, wasn't it? Betrayal seldom came crashing down like an anvil it dripped, a slow poison seeping into moments that were once tender. At first it was the subtle disinterest, the way she leaned away when he tried to kiss her, her absent-minded responses to his stories. Then came the late nights, the unexplained weekend work trips, and the glances at her phone she thought he didn't notice. There was something unmistakably intimate in the way she turned away from him, clutching that screen like it was her lifeline. The confirmation came on a Thursday evening, the air thick with expectation. Emma was in the shower, her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. A message preview flashed across the locked screen, a name he had seen before: Mark. "Can't wait to see you again." David felt his throat tighten, the room blurring for an instant as reality sank its claws deep. Whatever hope had clung to denial shattered in that moment, and he knew he had to act. He would not scream. He would not plead. He would not be humiliated in his own home. David's plan unfolded methodically over the next few days. He took a personal day from work, claiming a last-minute client emergency. He knew Emma wouldn't question it lately. Their lives ran parallel, rarely intersecting. That morning, he packed a small bag with a camera, a voice recorder, and a heart hardened against what he feared would come next. Hours passed as he watched his house from a parked car down the block. He could feel the pulse of anticipation in his chest, a mixture of rage, pain, and grim determination. At exactly 1 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up in front of the house. David watched as Mark stepped out, his casual confidence betraying the familiarity of someone who'd done this before. The man was tall, muscular, with a jawline that seemed chiseled for the sake of making other men feel inadequate. David's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his breath coming faster. They disappeared inside, the front door clicking shut, as if sealing away the life David thought he knew. Minutes ticked by. The sun blazed on his windshield, but he felt nothing but cold fury. Eventually he moved. Quietly he exited the car, camera in hand, and made his way to the side of the house where a gap in the curtains revealed everything he needed to see. Through the lens, he captured moments that seared themselves into his memory: Emma and Mark together, laughter turning to passion. Betrayal on full display in what was supposed to be their sanctuary. But David did not let the rage consume him. He took the photos, recorded snippets of damning audio, and retreated, his mind working through the next steps. His marriage was dead, but he would not let it end without consequence. He returned that evening as if nothing had happened. Emma barely acknowledged his presence, lost in her own world. David pretended not to notice, clinking his beer bottle against the kitchen counter as he observed her. He'd caught her once looking at him, a flash of discomfort in her eyes, but she quickly turned away. That was the only sign that she felt anything at all: guilt, fear, regret. It hardly mattered now. What mattered was that he had a plan, and it had just begun. The days following his discovery were an exercise in restraint. David walked through the motions of his life with a quiet, focused intensity masking the turmoil beneath. He watched Emma with careful precision, taking note of every small lie she told, every late-night excused away with rehearsed indifference. He stopped asking questions. Why bother? He already knew the answers. His first move was to secure an attorney. The meeting was cold and clinical, exactly what he needed. David presented his evidence: high-resolution photos of Emma's betrayal, audio clips that cut through any room's silence, and detailed logs of her movements. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Monroe, nodded with professional approval. "You've come prepared," she said, flipping through the stack of documents. "With this, we'll make sure she has nothing left to stand on." David left that meeting with a plan etched into stone. Emma would face the consequences of her choices, but it would be on his terms. In the days that followed, he lived alongside her like a ghost, unseen and unacknowledged. Emma never seemed to notice the extra tension in the air, the way he watched her just a little too closely. She was too wrapped up in her secrets to realize that hers had already been exposed. Late one evening, David walked into their bedroom, his footsteps soft on the carpet. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone with the detached focus of someone somewhere else. For a brief moment, he wondered if she felt any guilt at all, or if she believed she'd gotten away with it. He had to bite back a bitter laugh. Not yet, he thought. But soon. The last piece of his plan required confirmation, a final, inarguable act to seal his case. David told Emma he'd be working late, ensuring she believed she had the house to herself. He left through the front door, looping back through a neighbor's yard and into the shadows. The night stretched on as he waited, crouched behind thick shrubs outside the bedroom window. The clock ticked past midnight when he heard the faint creak of the front door. Mark had arrived. This time, David didn't just watch, he recorded every second, his hands steady, his breathing calm. Through the lens, he captured their intimacy, the whispers and touches that spoke of a relationship far beyond casual dalliance. It was raw, unfiltered, and damning. When he'd seen enough, David slipped away. His chest felt hollow, and the exhaustion from days of suppressing his rage hit him all at once. But he knew there could be no turning back. This was the end of their charade and the beginning of his retaliation. The divorce papers were served during a gathering with friends, a deliberate, calculated move on David's part. The night had started innocuously enough, with laughter and small talk, but he waited until everyone's attention was on him and Emma before he made his move. The envelope landed on the table with a heavy thud, silencing the room. "What is this?" Emma asked, her voice strained. David's eyes were cold, unblinking. "Open it." She did, her face draining of color as she scanned the documents. Around the table, murmurs of confusion and shock rippled. Mark, who had been standing with a glass of whiskey in hand, suddenly seemed very small. "Infidelity," David said, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the air. "It's all there. The photos, the messages. The moments you thought you could keep from me." He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "We're done." Emma's hands trembled. She glanced desperately at Mark. But he was rooted to the spot, eyes wide and breath caught in his throat. The humiliation was palpable, sinking into every corner of the room. The legal battle unfolded swiftly, thanks to the evidence David had gathered. Every attempt Emma made to fight for a portion of the assets fell flat. Catherine's precise and ruthless arguments left no room for sympathy. The judge granted David ownership of the house and their shared finances, leaving Emma with nothing but the clothes on her back. Mark's involvement in the proceedings was laughably futile. His bravado crumbled when it became clear he could offer no tangible support. The final court date arrived, and David watched Emma from across the courtroom. Her face was pale, drawn with stress. Mark sat beside her, but even from a distance, David could see the cracks in their alliance. The weight of what she'd done and what she'd lost was beginning to settle on her shoulders. The verdict was final. Emma's plea for spousal support was denied, and David was granted sole ownership of the home they'd once shared. It was over. Reality struck swiftly and mercilessly. Emma packed what little remained of her belongings and left with Mark. With no savings, no safety net, and a reputation in shambles, they had no choice but to move in with Mark's parents. The house was cramped, cluttered with old furniture, and the weight of expectations that went unspoken. From the moment they arrived, it was clear that they were unwelcome guests. The parents, wary of their son's affair, viewed Emma with barely concealed disdain. Meals were awkward, conversations stilted. In the privacy of their borrowed room, Emma and Mark began to unravel. Money was tight, tension high. Arguments broke out over the smallest of things: bills, expectations, regret. Mark, once confident and charming, grew resentful and bitter under the strain. He had promised Emma a new life, which she found was a prison of her own making. Meanwhile, David moved through the empty rooms of the house, reclaiming his space. There were moments of profound emptiness. After all, it was never just about revenge. But there was a sense of justice in the silence, a clarity that allowed him to breathe again. One evening, he parked a few blocks away from Mark's parents' home. He didn't approach, he wasn't there to gloat. He simply wanted to see them, to remind himself that consequences were not just words. Through a crack in the curtains, he glimpsed Emma sitting alone, shoulders hunched. It was enough. David drove away with no plans to return. The past was behind him, but its weight had shaped him, hardened him, and taught him exactly what he was capable of. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, cruel nightmare. David took his first breaths of true freedom with caution, half expecting some hidden cost to surface. But there was only silence in the house that once echoed with lies. The floors creaked underfoot, the air felt still. He realized he had never truly known what peace felt like, not until he stood alone in what was now entirely his. In the mornings, David resumed a routine he'd forgotten he loved. He brewed fresh coffee and lingered over the paper instead of rushing out the door. He called old friends he'd neglected during the slow decay of his marriage, their voices a warm reminder of who he used to be. Bit by bit, he reclaimed pieces of himself that he thought had been lost forever. There were difficult nights too, moments where the weight of betrayal pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. But instead of drowning in the pain, David confronted it. He forced himself to relive every detail, to strip away any illusions about what his marriage had been. Each time it hurt a little less. His therapist, a patient man with kind eyes named Dr. Ellis, helped him navigate this labyrinth. Rebuilding isn't about erasing what happened, Dr. Ellis said during one of their sessions. It's about understanding what it taught you and deciding what comes next. What if I don't know what comes next? David asked. Then you start small. Find what matters to you now. David threw himself into his work, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an escape. He found satisfaction in creating, building, solving problems that had nothing to do with fractured trust or shattered promises. He reconnected with his sister Claire, who had always suspected something was wrong but had been too polite to pry. Over dinners and long conversations, she became a lifeline, a tether to a past that wasn't all bad. He also picked up an old hobby, woodworking. The garage became his sanctuary, filled with the smell of sawdust and the rhythmic hum of power tools. Each project, each precisely cut joint, felt like a small triumph. Creating something whole from raw, broken pieces was a metaphor too perfect to ignore. Life for Emma and Mark deteriorated rapidly. At first, they tried to hold on to the illusion of a fresh start, nights spent whispering empty promises, convincing themselves that love could conquer humiliation and poverty. But reality gnawed at their resolve. Mark struggled to keep a steady job, bouncing from one underwhelming gig to the next. Bills piled up. The tension in the small house grew unbearable. Emma's days blurred together in a haze of monotony. Every moment reminded her of what she had lost: the spacious home, financial security, the respect of people who now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Mark's parents' resentment simmered beneath every forced smile and thinly veiled comment. The walls of the house seemed to close in, turning every argument into a shouting match, every silence into an indictment. The cracks in their relationship widened until they were impossible to ignore. Mark resented her for dragging him down, for being a constant reminder of what they'd done. Emma hated herself for believing in his empty promises. When their voices weren't raised in anger, they were sharp with quiet contempt. One rainy afternoon, David decided it was time for closure. He wrote a letter to Emma, not an apology, nor a love note, but a reminder. It was brief, carefully worded, and devoid of malice. Emma. Choices come with consequences. We both know this now. This letter isn't to gloat. I don't need to. I've seen what's left. I simply want you to remember that betrayal isn't an isolated act, it changes everything. I hope you understand that now in a way you never did before. I'm moving forward. I hope someday you can, too. David. He slipped it into an envelope, addressing it to Mark's parents' house. It wasn't meant to be a final wound, it was the last stitch, the closing of a scar. The rain had stopped by the time David stood outside his house, looking at the sky. Clouds hung heavy but distant, the air fresh with the promise of renewal. He breathed deeply, letting it fill him. Inside, his phone vibrated, a message from Claire, inviting him to a gathering at her place. Another step toward building something new. He smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth in his chest. As he walked back in, he glanced once more at the empty rooms. They weren't reminders of loss anymore, they were blank slates. He thought of the projects he still wanted to complete, the life waiting to be rediscovered. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the past slipping away. David shut the door behind him, leaving only the echoes of what had been. There would be no forgetting, but there could be moving on. He had learned what betrayal cost and he had paid it in full. Now, he was ready for something different, something better, something entirely his own.